So we discussed that the biological species concept is all about barriers. If one species cannot reproduce with another, then it's considered that they are different species. Here are some examples of why they may not be able to reproduce. What are the barriers preventing gene flow between two species? The first example, first of all of these examples are pre-zygotic barriers, meaning no zygote is made. There is no fertilized egg. Remember, a zygote is a fertilized egg. That doesn't happen in these cases. The first one is habitat isolation, meaning we have, for example, here two flies. And these flies, the one is the apple maggot fly and the other is a blueberry maggot fly. They look really similar. And maybe in an aquarium, they might be able to reproduce with one another. I don't know. But in the wild, they don't. Why? Because they live in different places and they lay their eggs on different things. So, for example, the apple maggot fly lays its eggs and feeds on apples and similar species, whereas the blueberry fly, as you might have guessed, lays its eggs on blueberries. They live on different plants, therefore they don't make babies with each other. They live in different habitats, therefore they don't have babies. Temporal isolation is when two species mate at different times or are out at different times. An example from your book is the spotted skunk, or the western and the eastern spotted skunk. They have different breeding times, and therefore even in areas where they overlap, they're not going to try to mate because they are mating at different times of the year. That's temporal isolation. Okay, what if there's behavioral isolation? That's when the behavior of one species does not attract the other species. And it shows an example of the blue-footed booby dancing here, these birds that are dancing. Now, if a blue-footed booby does a mating dance to a different species, it's going to just look at it like it's crazy and walk off, right? They're not going to try to mate. That dance only works with members of the same species. We've all encountered behavioral isolation. We've been to a party when some weirdo is at the party and is hitting on people and no one is going to go home with that weirdo. That's behavioral isolation. Okay? So that's when behavior keeps one organism from attempting to mate with another. But let's say we get past that. Let's say we're in the right place at the right time and the behaviors are okay and we try to mate. That leads us to these pre-zygotic barriers. This is when there is a mating attempt, but the egg is not fertilized. And there are two reasons why that could happen. And both examples that we see here, they're using some snails, different species of snails. These are real-life examples. One is mechanical isolation. Mechanical isolation is when two species try to mate, but their, how do I say this? Their parts don't line up. I'm sorry for the streaks. The parts don't line up. The parts don't work. The physical structures on the two species don't line up in such a way that allow mating to occur. Mechanical isolation. So there's no zygote formed. Lastly, gametic isolation. So in this case, you're in the right place, the right time, the behaviors are fine, the parts line up, but what happens is, now we're going to go to some Bio 1 level stuff, the egg has proteins in its outer surface, right, of the membrane. I'm just drawing exaggerations here, right? And the sperm has proteins as well that will dock to those and they'll recognize one another and fuse together if we're the same species. But if you have the wrong proteins on the surface of your egg or sperm, however you want to look at it, they will not fuse together and no fertilization will occur. So you have sex in this case, but the gamete is not formed because the egg and sperm do not fuse together. That's gametic isolation. By the way, you'll want to write these down, or there may be a table in the guided reading to help you with these as well. Lastly, post-zygotic barriers. These are barriers that happen if a zygote is formed, but we still consider the two parents different species. One example is reduced hybrid viability. That means a zygote is made a zygote is made, but the offspring usually don't develop and don't hatch or are not born alive. And if they are born alive, they're really sickly and they don't live very long. So that's reduced hybrid viability. Reduced hybrid fertility is kind of like when you have a donkey and a horse making a mule. The mule is sterile. It's perfectly healthy. It's viable, but it's sterile. That's reduced hybrid fertility. And lastly, we have one called hybrid breakdown, where hybrids are produced and they are viable and they are fertile, perhaps. But what happens is after another generation or so, they become small and sickly and die out. So they may actually survive for a bit, but they don't live very long and they're somewhat sickly. Even if they do, they may reproduce, like I said, but over time they die out. The hybrids die out. They don't give rise to very many generations, and they don't breed well with themselves. They don't breed well with the parents that gave rise to them, and so they don't. Those hybrids just don't leave offspring. Okay. So that's called hybrid breakdown. Now, if you've overcome all of that, if you're in the right place at the right time, and your behavior's okay, and your parts line up, and your egg and sperm fuse together, and your offspring are viable, and they're fertile, and they give rise to offspring that are viable and fertile, then we can consider those two species that started all this the same species based on the biological species concept. So you can see all of that together. So this shows you species 1 and 2. They try to breed, it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Here they do produce offspring, but once again the hybrids don't survive. The hybrids are sterile, or maybe some of them do survive and they're fertile, but their offspring die off. They don't last very long. So if you overcome all of that, then you can be considered the same species. But it gets messy because some organisms that we clearly recognize as different species can hybridize and produce fertile, viable offspring. For example, in areas where grizzly bears, scary, and polar bears, scary, get together, they can hybridize and produce roller bears. We can see similar examples from our own past where we know that Neanderthals lived in Europe and parts of what we may call the Middle East back in the day, and that humans leaving Africa would have passed through some of the Neanderthal range, and we can see that we actually hybridized with them. When we look at modern human DNA, we can see that people who originate in Africa, as we all do, but never left Africa, have no Neanderthal DNA in their genome. But groups of individuals such as here we see Han Chinese, French, folks from Papua New Guinea, they have Neanderthal DNA in their system. In fact, a study from 2010 shows that between 1 and 4% of the genome of non-African humans is Neanderthal in origin. And Neanderthals went away around 30,000 years ago. But here we have a clear example of hybridization, and obviously it produced fertile, viable offspring, but we definitely consider Neanderthals and humans to be different species because they're very different in their bone structure and their societies and things. By the way, I myself am 2.3% Neanderthal, which is actually kind of low compared to most folks of European descent. So the biological species concept is limited. Like I said earlier, it cannot be applied to asexual critters or fossils. It emphasizes the absence of gene flow, but we know that gene flow can occur between things that we still typically consider distinct species. So it has been suggested that we may need some different species concepts. One example of a species concept is the kind you might use if you have a bird guide or a field guide. Morphological species concept, which is just based on the shape and structure of an organism. It's not a good way to just name things, though, from a phylogenetic perspective, because we will create paraphyletic and polyphyletic groups by accident. But it's a good way to key things out. The ecological species concept is based on the ecological niche of an organism. What does it eat? Where does it live? That's one suggested species concept. And the phylogenetic concept is the idea that we should use evolutionary history to name what a species is. The smallest group of organisms that share a common ancestor would be a species. And these are just 3 of more than 20 different proposed species concepts. So we typically kind of use the biological species concept, but I think maybe the phylogenetic concept is more and more recognized as we go on. It's just a little bit harder to apply if you don't know the evolutionary history of every species you run into. Anyway, so when we pick up in the next video, we'll talk about how and why speciation might occur.